Good afternoon, dear friends. You are watching the author's blog of Ruslan Belov. I present my thoughts based on the most reliable sources possible. I sincerely ask you to support my work by subscribing to the channel. You know, I stand for honesty and objectivity. In this case, I will speak about the United States. Their intelligence services carried out a brilliant operation. Truly brilliant. They bribed the right people in Maduro's inner circle. Then the army moved in. No one fired at them, no one resisted. Maduro was simply handed over to them. They took Maduro and flew away. That's it. The threat has been eliminated. He was delivered to New York, where he will face trial. For us, this is certainly a sad event, because if the current authorities in Venezuela now give up their positions, the country will become pro-American. Thus, a state that was allied with Russia may ultimately turn either into a neutral country or even into one hostile toward Russia. But I repeat, the job was done brilliantly, truly brilliantly. Of course, if Russia had managed to carry out a similar scenario in Kyiv in 2022, enter, reach agreements and bribe the necessary people so that Russian troops would be let in, so that they could enter, detain Zelensky together with his wife, take them to Russia, and allow a pro-Russian administration to be established, then, undoubtedly, events would have unfolded very differently. However, history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. Everything happens as it happens. Fighting along the line of contact continues, and we continue to analyze the current situation together. Let's open the map. So friends, it is the weekend now, and therefore there are few news reports from the front. This, of course, does not mean at all that the fighting has stopped, that the fighters are lying somewhere and resting. Nothing of the sort. There are no holidays for the front. This is merely background noise. In general, the intensity of combat does not depend on whether it is a weekday, a weekend, or a holiday. It is simply that during such periods, information comes in less frequently, and there are significantly fewer pieces of objective control footage. But do you know what still came in over the weekend? Several video materials appeared, which unfortunately I cannot show on YouTube. The videos show how sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to infiltrate Myrnohrad. They enter there with their flags. Why? It's simple, to film videos and then declare, look, we have recaptured part of Myrnohrad. You can probably guess how all of this ended. And it is important to note, these are not some territorial defense units and not mobilized personnel, but quite elite units. Naval infantry of the armed forces of Ukraine. Yes, they have that as well. We are talking about the 38th Marine Brigade. Over the weekend, they sent groups with flags 3 times, trying to enter Myrnohrad. The outcome of all these attempts was the same. A small spoiler, they do not return. Now let us move on to the issue of advances. Today's episode will be relatively short, since there are few updates, only a few areas where changes to the front line have actually been recorded. These are the ones we will examine now. The first and most significant update concerns the Alexandrovka area. Previously, this sector was called the Slavyansk sector. Now it is more often referred to as the Alexandrovka sector, and some even classify it as part of the Slavyansk direction. Slavyansk is, of course, still quite far away, but Alexandrovka, an important settlement located on high ground, already looks like a very realistic objective for the coming months. What is happening here? At the moment, the armed forces of Ukraine are not able to stabilize the situation. The front line continues to move, and quite rapidly. To give you a sense of scale, the breakthrough carried out by the fighters of the South grouping amounted to, let's even measure it precisely. So if measured directly, it is more than 7 kilometers. If measured to the main line, it is about 5.5 kilometers, which is also a very serious figure. The total area of occupied territory marked on the map exceeds 15 square kilometers. This is a truly impressive result. The South grouping continues to surprise, dismantling the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine, which previously seemed monolithic and almost impenetrable. And if you recall, the Slavyansk sector for a long time was considered absolutely dead, without any prospects at all. Now, along with the sector in the area of responsibility of the East grouping, it has become one of the most active and dynamically developing sections of the front. Moreover, there are actually more advances here than are shown on the map. There is simply not enough objective control footage yet. For example, the Ministry of Defense reported that the village of Bandan, which is located west of Novosyukovka, has come under our control. On the map, this advance has not yet been colored in, since there have been no confirming video materials. However, according to information from fighters on the ground, Bandan is indeed under our control. For now, the question of full control over the settlement remains not entirely clear, but our units entered the village and entrenched themselves there. I think that in the near future, confirming footage will appear, and then this sector can also be officially marked on the map. The capture of Bandan means that fighting for Nikiforovka will begin in the near future. And from Nikiforovka to Alexandrovka, as they say, it is just a stone's throw away. That's how things stand. Among the nearest prospects, one should also expect the elimination of the pocket between Pasino and Reznikovo. As for Reznikovo itself, fighting continues there. I have already seen reports in some channels claiming that the settlement has been taken, but this does not correspond to reality. The battles for the village are in full swing. What other changes were there? On the Konstantinovka direction, a small advance has been recorded north of Yablanovka. However, overall it can be said that the front line there has stalled. These movements do not yet indicate anything concrete. The sector is difficult, saturated with strongpoints, and it is extremely hard to steadily move the front line forward there. If you look back over the past 6 months, there have been practically no significant updates on this direction. In essence, the Alexandrovka and Konstantinovka directions are all the sectors from which objective control footage has arrived confirming our advances. But probably many of you are also concerned about the situation in Kupiansk. What is going on there? At the moment, our units continue to hold their positions. Control is maintained in the Yubilini microdistrict, in the central part of the right bank, as well as on the left bank, in the industrial zone. Has the situation improved? Overall, no. A real improvement is possible only if stable and reliable logistics to the right bank can be established. And for that, a large amount of work needs to be done north of the city. This is a matter of not days, but weeks and possibly months. Therefore, the situation there remains difficult for now. Nevertheless, the city is being held, despite all the challenges. To sum up, over the past 24 hours, approximately 16 square kilometers of territory have come under Russian control. For the beginning of January, this is quite a decent result. One would like to hope that in the coming days there will be more updates and that the episodes will become longer and more informative. But for now, we have what we have: holiday days, and the flow of information is objectively smaller. I see no point in speaking just for the sake of speaking or pouring water, inventing something out of nothing. Dear viewers, I would like to continue talking about heroism and remember something. The most vivid and memorable examples of individual and collective courage in the SVO zone in 2025 were demonstrated by servicemen operating directly on the line of contact with the enemy, assault units. The key event from this perspective was the liberation of the Kursk region. However, in other areas as well, and under a wide variety of circumstances, Russian fighters repeatedly proved their resilience and self-sacrifice. One of the central military episodes of 2025 was the return to control of the territories of the Kursk region that had been seized by the enemy in August 2024. The Kursk liberation operation had an extremely serious impact on the overall course of the special military operation. It was precisely after the defeat on this axis that the enemy was forced to expend a significant portion of its strategic reserves and lost the ability to retain the initiative on the battlefield. The very fact of the temporary occupation of the border areas of the Kursk region became a severe blow for the entire country, and above all for the residents of those territories. Ruskoye Porechnoye and Nikolayevo Darino, where the occupiers brutally killed all local residents, have forever entered history as tragic symbols comparable to Katyn. The seizure and looting of the district center of Sudzha and dozens of surrounding settlements, hundreds of killed, tortured, and abducted civilians, destroyed homes and desecrated churches, the evacuation of more than 100,000 people, all of this will remain an unhealed wound in the national memory. At the same time, the Kursk operation became not only a page of pain, but also an example of the highest level of heroism. One of the most striking episodes of this campaign was the operation codenamed Flow. Russian fighters, having covered almost 15 kilometers through an underground pipe of the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhhorod main gas pipeline, managed to reach the enemy's rear and thereby ensured the successful liberation of Sudzha. Our units already had experience with such actions. In 2024, fighters of the Veterans Brigade used an underground collector approximately 3 kilometers long to enter the rear of the Ukrainian grouping during the assault on Avdiivka. However, in the case of Sudzha, the task was significantly more difficult. The underground route was 5 times longer, and moreover, gas continued to flow through the pipeline until January 1, 2025. Preparation for the operation began almost immediately after gas pumping was halted. The main objective was to make it possible for personnel to move inside the pipe, where a substantial amount of toxic residues remained. These were pumped out as much as possible, ventilation outlets were installed, and the supply of oxygen into the pipe was organized. On average, traversing this section took a fighter with weapons and full gear from 1.5 to 2 days. Accordingly, it was necessary in advance to create accumulation and rest points, equip sanitary areas, place supplies of water and food, and deliver ammunition for crew-served weapons. Fighters carried their personal ammunition load themselves. All preparatory work was conducted under conditions of the strictest secrecy. The circle of individuals admitted to the operation was minimal, and the use of equipment and resources was tightly restricted. Participants involved in setting up the underground route later recalled that some ventilation shafts were located in close proximity to enemy positions. Conversations of Ukrainian servicemen and Polish mercenaries could be clearly heard. To transport weapons and ammunition into the pipe, several cargo carts were lowered, as well as 3 electric scooters. In total, about 800 personnel took part in the operation. Fighters of the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade, the 30th Regiment of the 72nd Motor Rifle Division, the Akhmat Special Purpose Unit, as well as volunteers from the Assault Brigades, Veterans, and Vostok FIO. Many participants learned of the specific task literally on the eve of the operation. This was required by counterintelligence measures. Any information leak could have led to failure and enormous losses. For this reason, conducting preliminary training was impossible. Group commanders tried to select the most physically resilient and psychologically stable fighters, also preferring not to take those who were too tall because of the confined space. At the same time, there were more volunteers than needed. Refusal was perceived as a serious personal affront. The most difficult ordeal was movement through the pipe, where a persistent smell of methane was present and there was an acute lack of oxygen, despite all safety measures taken. After just a few hundred meters, people's muscles and joints began to ache due to the need to move in a half-bent position. To reduce the load, fighters left helmets, armor plates from vests, canned food, and even water inside the pipe. At the same time, no one abandoned ammunition. Almost all participants suffered poisoning from residual gases. Bouts of nausea began, hallucinations, panic reactions, and cases of loss of consciousness occurred. Those affected were brought to ventilation outlets whenever possible, given time to catch their breath, and then continued moving. Meter by meter, hour by hour, the columns advanced. All these inhuman trials proved justified. At 5:30 a.m. on March 8th, 800 Russian fighters suddenly appeared deep in the enemy's rear, just 2 kilometers north of the center of Sudzha, and immediately entered the fight. The element of surprise proved decisive. The enemy was disoriented and seized by panic. Combined with strikes from other directions, this made it possible to liberate 10 settlements, including Sudzha itself, within 4 days. And I will conclude with this story. In the settlement of Otradnoye in the Dnipropetrovsk region, one of our assault fighters was wounded and cut off from our forces. In the basement of one of the houses destroyed by mortar fire from the armed forces of Ukraine, he found a paralyzed elderly woman and her daughter. For some time, the Russian soldier took care of them, and as soon as an opportunity arose, he led them out to territory controlled by our troops, carrying the elderly woman in his arms. It is this heroism and readiness to sacrifice oneself for others, this understanding of the interests of the country as one's own, that makes the Russian army the most combat-ready in the world. When Lieutenant Colonel Korolev, who was later killed in the Kharkiv region, was on leave after being wounded, His daughter, an 11th grade student, asked him, "Dad, isn't it wrong that we're having fun here while you're fighting over there?" "My dear," the officer replied, "that's exactly why we fight, so that you can live and enjoy life. And with that, I'll conclude. I wish everyone peaceful skies overhead and see you again soon."